Hey, everybody, welcome to Lunch with Kevin, Lunch Live with Kevin. But I have a guest. Her name is Mary Abbajay, and we're going to talk today about a very important topic that no one's really talking about in this brave new world of remote work. Mary Abbajay is my guest. You see her there. She is the author of a book called Managing Up. I don't know how many hundred people I've told about her book, Managing Up. You can see our conversations or listen to our conversation on my podcast, the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, wherever you get podcasts. But Mary's here today because I asked her to come join me to talk about this idea of how do we manage up? How do we manage our boss when we can't see our boss, when our boss is at a distance from us? So Mary, first of all, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's always a delight and a pleasure and an honor to be in your presence, Kevin Mary. So thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Okay, you can pay me for that later, Mary. I appreciate that. Before we get started, though, I mean, I think it's important that I just sort of ask, like, how are you and your family doing? You're like 60 days into the shelter in place, I suppose. So how are you and your family and your team doing with all of this?
Well, we're doing pretty well, actually, 60 days in. My team always has been a virtual workplace, so we've got that kind of down. That's kind of easy. We're moving our clients into the virtual realm, so that's been going pretty well. I haven't killed my husband yet, so 60 days in, he's still, a viable human being, so thanks to the wine at night. So I think we're doing pretty well, and I am an introvert, so I think it's a little bit easier for me. But I am starting to get a little antsy. I do kind of miss seeing my clients. I miss being in the room with people. I miss traveling. So it's starting to get a little harder.
Gotcha. So before we get into the nuance, the remote part of all this, let's just talk about some of you're not going to give away the book. People still need to go buy a copy of Managing Up, but give people some sense of what are some big ideas we ought to be thinking about when we're trying to manage our bosses?
Yeah. So a couple of things you want to keep in mind. Number one is that your boss has a lot of influence over your career trajectory, right? Your boss has a lot of influence over the types of projects you work on, the types of teams you're part of, your visibility in the organization and your industry, and kind of those opportunities that come your way. So if that's really important, so if your boss has that kind of influence over you, it's important that you have a really robust relationship with that person, right? And that's what Managing Up is. It's about managing that relationship so that you can succeed, your boss can succeed, and the organization can succeed. Because the other thing that really matters is that your careers matter. Like, we all have careers. And if part of our career success requires having a good relationship with our boss, then we have to do what we can do to make that happen. Because the third really main principle, Kevin, as I know you know, is that as much as we wish we could, we cannot change other people. We can only change and have control over how we interact, right? What we do, our interactions. So if your boss doesn't like to operate the way that you like to operate, you're going to have a couple of choices. And your choices are, you're either going to figure it out and learn to adapt, or you're going to have to find a boss that operates more like you, essentially, right? So we like the way we operate. So it's about really finding that platinum rule. How does the other person like to operate and interact, and then seeing what you can do to adapt to their style as authentically and respectfully and robustly as possible.
Okay, so I have to stop you right there. That's completely true. So, and if you were my boss, which you're not, and you're glad that I don't work for you, I suppose. But if you were my boss, what I would need to know right now is that you're standing on a balancing ball while you're doing this with me, and I can't get past the fact that she's standing on this balancing ball while we're doing this. So this just shows that she's got a bunch of talent. And so the reality is, yeah, I wanted to say that and be silly, but there's a point, and that is, in order for me to manage my boss, I got to understand where they're at, where they're coming from, right? So let's talk about that, because one of the things I love about your book and about your work is this idea of I got to understand their lens better. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So we all have preferences of how we like to operate, right? We all have certain things that drive us, certain motivations, certain priorities, certain preferences, certain pet peeves. And in order to really align yourself well with, by the way, it could be your colleague, it could be people below you, above you, your spouses. It's important to understand what's important to the other person. What are their preferences in terms of communication? What are their priorities in terms of the workplace? How do they like to work? What happens is we tend to operate from our own lens, right? And then we get a little judgy and annoyed when people have a completely different way of operating or a different perspective. And so if you really want to try to work well with somebody else, it's really important to understand how that person likes to communicate, how that person likes to work, and stop getting stuck by what we want and start thinking about what's going to work for the other person. And then we can try to find a way that we can do a strategy that's going to work for us and for them. It's the big and.
Exactly. And so I want to stop right now. And for all of you that are with us and are joining us, please know that while I have questions clearly that I can ask, we want to get the questions that you have, and we have one already from LinkedIn. So I'm going to ask that. I haven't read it yet. In fact, I put the glasses on so I can read it. But please, if you've got questions, wherever you're watching us from, please send them in, and we'll be happy to talk about it. Let's see. Petco on LinkedIn says, if you and your boss are aligned for most topics perfectly, how do you progress from that point? Well, that's an awfully good starting point. You want to say a little bit more about that?
I will. So Petco, if that is your case, congratulations. There's not a lot of managing up you have to do. You just get to be you, right? You get to work together well. You get to, like, Bluebirds are going to bring you coffee every day for breakfast. I'm sure it's wonderful. But those areas that you may not be aligned, that's where you might want to look at, like, oh, how could we fix this part of our relationship? Or how could I align myself better on this thing? But if you're pretty much aligned, then you are good to go. Because what happens is we're going to have a spectrum of experience with bosses, right? Whether they're good bosses or bad bosses, we're going to have a spectrum of experience of how easy they are for us to work with. So on one end of the spectrum, you're going to have what I call the unicorn boss, the boss that Petco has, the boss where they're aligned, they're in sync, we have the same sort of preferences and priorities, and we just get each other, right? Then you might have on the whole other end of that spectrum, you might have what I call the truly terrible boss, like the screamer, the shouter, the bully, the toxic person. And when you have somebody that's truly terrible, truly toxic, there's not a lot you can do to thrive with that boss. You can survive for a while, but you really have to get yourself away. But in the middle, you're going to have bosses that are more or less difficult, more or less easy for you, more or less aligned with you, more or less difficult. And that's really where the art and the heart of managing up comes from. Like, how do you deal with those bosses in the ways that when you are not aligned, when they are hard from you, when they are frustrating, when they are annoying, when they're micromanagers, when they're impulsives, when their behavior is difficult. That's where managing up.
You're making me anxious, and I don't even have a boss.
Yeah, so that's when it gets hard, because then we get anxious, and when we're anxious, it's hard to manage up. Sorry, Kevin.
No, it's fine. I was just trying to be silly. So here's the thing. So let's go. I was going to ask you this later, but let's ask it now, because let's sort of make the transition to all of this remotely, right? Working virtually. And people are already making that connection in their own head, but I'd like us to spend the rest of our time sort of really there. And so let's just say, to that point, what if your boss is a very poor remote leader? Well, first of all, they need to read my book, right? But yes, other than that, what advice do you have specifically? Like, we're working remotely. My boss is just not doing a very good job. They're just not leading very effectively remotely. What do we do?
Yeah, so it's probably a pretty large challenge out there, because we know before going into this that something like, 60, 70%, you probably know the figure, of managers distrusted remote work in the first place, right? And a lot of people really aren't that aligned with it. So the first thing I want you to do, this is going to sound weird, but I want you to be kind and empathetic, right? If your boss isn't good at remote leadership, and I'm assuming they may have been okay in face-to-face, then you have to understand that this is a big learning curve for them as well. So get a little empathy, get a little patient, get a little kindness going. And then what you can do is you want to try a couple things. One is you want to stay connected with them. And this is, by the way, what you want to do regardless if they're good or the bad remotely. Stay on their radar, stay connected. I want to see a daily check-in with them. With the remote boss who's not good at it, I also want you to gently make suggestions of how they can manage better the team. Make suggestions around, what if we tried this? What if we tried that? See if you can encourage a weekly dialogue around setting up priorities, setting up communication frameworks, like how are we going to communicate, and see what you can do to kind of fill in for that boss with the rest of the team. I'm assuming you have a team. So be patient, be kind, suggest strategies, and make effective requests. Like, what if we tried this? I think it would help with XYZ.
Yeah, and I would add, I'm going to add something. I want to make another observation. And the thing I would add would be, remember, Mary already said that one of the things we need to do is understand what their priorities are. So if I can own, hey, boss, hey, Mary, we'll say you're the boss. You wouldn't be a very poor remote leader, but we'll just play this for a second. So hey, Mary, I'm struggling with priorities. Can we have a conversation? And I bet I'm not the only one. Can we have a conversation as a team about how we can get our priorities aligned? So it's true, you're not lying, but you're coming at it from the perspective that person's going to be valuable to them too. It doesn't feel as much like as a suggestion to them as a suggestion for us. Comments about that?
That is exactly the right way to do it. So you framed what I call a perfect request. You gave the request what it was, right? And you said why you needed it, how it would help you and others. And then, of course, you'd make it easy for the boss by saying, how about we do this on Fridays at 10? So that it did not highlight their dysfunction, right? It highlighted a need from you. And I think you did that perfectly. So yes, Kevin, we can meet about priorities.
I like that. That's good. Now, here, the other thing is you said that we should grant them be empathetic. I would say grant them some grace, same thing. And I love that. And I want you all to note what I did at the start of this conversation, if you were with us when we started. And after I introduced Mary, I asked her how she was doing, how her team was doing, how her family was doing. And I did that because I wanted to know, but I also knew that this would come up. So the idea is that we need to make sure in our conversations with our boss that we're getting some clue about what's going on for them, because this is hard for them too. This is the exact same advice that I'm giving leaders every day right now, is we've got to be empathetic first. We got to talk about thoughts and feelings before we get to the tasks. And I'm suggesting the same thing for you with your boss to help continue to nurture and create the relationship. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. No, I say that's one of the, I have a couple of tips around how to manage it virtually. And that is one of the key ones. And I call it have the conversation. And if folks want to email me afterwards, I will send them the questions. But it's about finding out like what is going on with them virtually. What are they worried about? We did a survey with some of our clients, and something like 43% of our clients said they were worried about their ability to succeed as a virtual manager. So you want to have this conversation. Ask your manager, what are your virtual communication preferences? What are your priorities right now? What are you worried about? What concerns you? What are lower priorities? Like what's going on? Like really have a conversation. There's about 7 or 8 questions. I'm happy to send them to you. But as Kevin said, like really get to know what's going on with your boss. It's one of the key things you can do.
Perfect. So if they want that, what do they need to do?
Just email me, mary@careerstonegroup.com. Find me on Twitter @Mary Abbajay. Find me on LinkedIn @Mary Abbajay. I'm easy to find, people. Easy to find.
Abba like the band, Jay like the bird. That's what I always tell people.
I love that.
All right. So anyway, we got a couple more questions from LinkedIn. Okay. The clue is, Kevin has his glasses on. What if your boss is younger than you and doesn't want to be challenged? Mary, talk about that for a second.
He doesn't want to be challenged. Well, first of all, I'm going to have to I'm going to have to question your assumption. So I get they may not want to be challenged, but are you sure it's because they're younger than you? Like, so I would really question that assumption. And what don't they want to be challenged about? And is it that they don't want to be challenged when you come up with a different idea? Then I'm going to, if that's what it is, like, oh, they don't want to be challenged in their leadership, then I think you go back to making effective requests. And just as Kevin did in the beginning, you say, you know what, I've been noticing, this is going on. In my experience, sometimes this can help. And I'm thinking, if we could do a little bit of this, what do you think? If you feel they don't want to be challenged in a group setting, set up a one-on-one conversation. And when you give them alternative ideas, make sure you're doing them in a request, and you show how that request is going to be good for them, good for the team, good for the organization, and good for you. So I would say this is very much about how you do something instead of what you do, and to notice when they're prickly and when they're not. But drop the assumption that's because they're young, because that's not helpful information for you. It just adds another blinder.
There you go. I'm with that 100%. So the other question, and I'm trying to frame it because I don't know that I quite get it. So I'm going to read it. What percentage would you allocate to the generation that the bosses come from, which dictates their leadership style? I think the question is really about how does the generation or age play into leadership style? I think that's the question. If we didn't quite get it, give us a follow-up. But you want to talk about that for just a second, Mary?
Yeah, so I think it plays a part, a medium-sized part. And I don't actually think it's because of the age of the person per se. I think it's about the culture in which they learned how to be a manager, right? So if you have a baby boomer that came from a culture of kind of baby boomer style leadership, where it was all teamwork, where it was like, annual 360s, then I think where it was kind of more hierarchical, then I think they're likely to take on that kind of leadership style because that's what they were taught. That's what was modeled to them. A Gen Xer might be a little more informal, a little less relationship oriented, a little more task oriented, very much about, I don't need to see you to get your work done. We don't need to work, And a millennial or a Gen Z may be much more comfortable with a virtual style of leadership, might be much more consensus driven. So I think the age is relevant in relation to whatever organization that they learned, the culture they learned to manage in. And what was really popular during on the leadership and management kind of literature and theory at the time. Because I do think old dogs can learn new tricks. And I have seen young people absorb like the old baby boomer style of leadership. So I think it really depends on how they were kind of raised in leadership.
Okay, cool. So what about what specifically is different, right? Like, so, and there's variations in this, I've been working with some folks just recently that they got hired since, they've never met everybody. Like they got hired, they started their job, they got hired, then they started their job working from home and everybody's at home. So there's all that, but like, how is managing up different now when we're all remote? And I guess it could depend on how well we knew the boss or how much experience we had with that manager before. But like, what's different specifically now when we're not face-to-face with folks?
Yeah, so I think what's different is that we're not face-to-face. And I think we all know that the social distance that we have with people when we can't read their body language, when we don't see them in the hallway, when we don't have like immediate access to them, really changes and kind of crimps our communication, right? And because it takes so much more effort now to be connected to anybody, we've got to like get on a phone call, we got to do Zoom, man. My God, I have Zoom gloom. I'm so tired of it, right? So I think the key is to do what you can. My couple of tips around this is it's going to take a little bit more effort than before. For some of you may be in a great place because maybe your boss was a total nightmare and now you don't have to see that person every day. So that might be great for you. But for others, it's really about making sure you maintain connection. So one of my big tips for people managing remotely is to make sure you stay on your boss's radar every single day. It doesn't mean a long conversation or a long Zoom meeting, but make sure that you are daily checking in, whether it's an email, whether it's a quick phone call or a text. Make sure your boss really is aware of what you are working on. Like cover your priorities. Make sure they know your work stream. What challenges might you be having? Don't assume they know what you're getting done. So really keep them abreast and really check in with them. You want to be the person that when this all ends, they remember that you are working hard and working strong and you were there for them.
Perfect. So this is some really, really valuable and very practical ideas. We are talking with Mary Abbajay. If you didn't know, she's the author of the wonderful book, Managing Up. There's where you can find more about it, Managing Up the book. And so that's really good stuff. So here's the question. Are there specific things that we ought to be managing up about now? Or are there anything that maybe we should be putting on the back burner? Like any advice about the topics or the areas that we might want to be thinking about managing our boss up about?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is the whole working virtual process, right? So I would really recommend that you do a weekly or an every other week check-in with your boss, and you just ask the question, like, how is our virtual engagement going? Are things we could do more of? Things I could do more of, less of, or differently. So you want to be getting feedback on the processes as well. The other thing that you want to be managing up around is around priorities, making sure that everybody's on the same page about priorities. I love what you said in the beginning. That's a conversation we should be having all the time. Are we all aligned in our priorities? Things I'd recommend that you put off until we get back together is things like asking for a raise. I really recommend you don't. And here's why. It's a very stressful time. A lot of companies are, now this unless you are an essential worker and you're not get paid enough anyway, go get that raise. But for a lot of organizations, make sure you understand what the financial situation is. It may not be the best time to ask for a raise right now. So I would say that. The other thing that I think is really important for people to understand is around managing up around your availability and your boundaries. And what happens oftentimes is, so we want to be transparent about when you're available to work. I want you to be transparent because we know a lot of people are now trying to work at home, raise their children, homeschool their children. They may be cohabitating with other adults that also need the Wi-Fi. Maybe there's only one office in your room. I was doing a Zoom call with someone and he was literally in the bathroom. I said, hey, dude, you need to turn that camera off. So make sure that you have, and you negotiate. So if you have time constraints, with working at home, make sure you negotiate that with your boss. Make sure you are transparent about when you are available and when you're not available. If you literally have to do 2 hours of homeschooling a day, then you need to let your boss know that that's what you're going to do, and then negotiate when you're going to make up that time. When you say you're available, you better be available. So tell your boss the best way to reach you, text, email, phone, whatever, and then make sure you monitor that channel regularly. It's really important that bosses, to build trust, when they reach out, they're going to get a prompt reply. So those are a couple of things I want you to really pay attention to in managing up.
It's perfect. So the point that you just made is a super important one, is that many you or perhaps your coworkers are living this world of juggling balls they can't drop, which is how I've been calling it. And so we did a session, Mary, a couple of weeks ago with a couple of educators and I, where we got on, and that's all available on that link right there, keviniconberry.com/live, where we talked all about how do you parent and how do you, spouse. These are not verbs, I suppose. And while you're supposed to be working, and how do you hook all that together? How do you balance all that out? So if that's you, you need to be doing all that stuff to be transparent with your boss and getting clear expectations and agreements with your boss. But if you're still, thankfully in some states, this is starting to come to a close as we get near the end of May. But if that's still something you're challenged with, or people are challenged with, have them go to keviniconberry.com/live, and you can watch a really, I think, some really great stuff. We had a great conversation. We had lots of people interacting and asking us questions along the way. And of course, this is where you can go get Mary's book. What else, Mary, before we start to wrap up?
The last thing I would say.
Go ahead.
The last thing I would say is this is a great opportunity to learn something new. Be entrepreneurial. Like, this won't last forever, but if you see gaps or new ways to do something or new ways to serve your clients or your customers, be the person that solves the problem. Be the person that learns the technology. Be that person that steps in and says, I can make this happen. I have an idea for this. Here's how we can fix this. Because you want your boss to remember that you were the resilient, the positive, the go-getter, the moving forward, proactive person when you get back. So use this as an opportunity to shine.
So we do have another question from LinkedIn, and the question is, it's kind of in that vein a bit. It says, how would you convince the boss to change the business model because the industry has changed? So like
I
if you're
love it.
seeing stuff that you're not sure the boss is seeing, which may or may not be true, but if you don't think they're seeing it, what do you do or say about that?
Okay, so first of all, this is going to be personality dependent in terms of what does your boss need to see to be persuaded? Is he or she a data person? Are they an innovation person? Like if you have any got personality profiles, do they want a lot of information? Do they want to know what the problem is? So figure out like how your boss likes to be persuaded. Put together not a proposal, but here's an idea. Here's why I think it would work. Here's who else is doing it. Here's what we could do. Like, so you want to figure out what that would look like. I'd also recommend finding other people that know your boss very well and asking them, like, socialize the idea a little bit with other people, get a little feedback, figure out how to approach your boss. And when you do approach the new business model, again, you have to tell me what kind of data that boss needs to have to be convinced. But make sure you don't denigrate the way things are currently done, right? So make sure you say, hey, how we do things now is great. And look at all these different ways, and here's who's finding success with it. And here's how I think it could work for us if we adopted some of those. So baby step it a little bit, socialize it a little bit, and definitely plan it around your boss's personality.
Listen, everybody, if you have been joining us, you're getting the full consulting mode from Mary here, and this is where you can learn more about her and her team and the work that they do. Anything you want to say about that real quick, Mary, before we start to wrap up?
No, I would love stay in touch with me. Find me on social media. I love answering questions. So just stay in touch with me. Send me cool stuff.
There you go. Mary Abbajay, everybody. And so thank you, Mary, for being here. It was a pleasure. I knew it would be fun. It was. I knew it'd be valuable, and it has been. So thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you. And so everybody, we'll be back on Wednesday. I have another guest on Wednesday. If you are introverted and trying to do, I know you say you are, Mary, but you sure don't act like it in this setting.
I'm highly functioning.
Jennifer Kahnweiler and I, who's written several books around introverts and introverts as leaders, introverts at work. She's got a brand new book coming out in a few weeks. She's going to join me on Wednesday. We're going to talk about introversion and remote work, whether you are that person, maybe you're struggling, maybe you're loving it, right? But maybe you work with introverts and you're having a hard time understanding how to do that, work with them more effectively during this time. That's what Jennifer and I are going to talk about on Wednesday. Same time, 12:05 Eastern time, same bat channels, whether you're on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, wherever you found us, you can find us again then. Hope you'll do that. Mary, thanks again so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you. And Marissa has been watching on LinkedIn. She's not able to say anything right now, but Mary and I will wave at Marissa. And we'll thank all of you and hope you come back. Be well, be safe, and be remarkable.